We continue with Chapter 6. The reader might sensibly wonder why the social sciences, the criminal justice system, and indeed much of the English-speaking world label white people Caucasian. Why should this category have sprung from a troublesome mountainous borderland just north of Turkey, from peoples perpetually at war with Russia in the present-day regions of Chechnya, Stavropol, Krai, Dagestan, Ingushetia, North Ossetia, South Ossetia, and Georgia. The long story begins in Göttingen, Lower Saxony, in 1795, and the better-known part of it belongs to Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. Blumenbach, born in 1752, make sure that's clear, looks clear. He died in 1840, was born into a well-connected academic family in the East Central German region of Thuringia. Excuse me. My vehicle, my mobile studio animal is running free. Recognized as a progeny by age 16 in 1768, he delivered a flattering address to an influential audience on the occasion of the local duke's birthday, thereby opening the way to further recognition. 7 years later, his 1775 Göttingen doctoral dissertation on the natural variety of mankind, only 15 pages long in revision, was the fruit of a year's study with an older professor who owned an extraordinarily large and disordered natural history collection. On the natural variety of mankind went into several editions and made Blumenbach both a medical doctor and an instant star in the German academic firmament. And we got a little asterisk here. The great Linnaeus, the inventor of the Western system of taxonomy, shot high even faster. After 1 week, he received his PhD for a 13-page dissertation from the Dutch University of Harderwijk, which one historian of science designated as a mail order institution. This seems unduly harsh. Nevertheless, the University of Harderwijk was known for selling degrees. All right. Now, in his mid-20s, he quickly joined the faculty of the George August University at Göttingen, the most prestigious center of modern education for young German nobles. Much sought after as an intellectual mentor, Blumenbach taught a bevy of aristocrats and other privileged men, including 3 English princes, the Crown Prince of Bavaria, and the scholarly aristocratic brothers Wilhelm and Alexander von Humboldt. Blumenbach's prime years in the last quarter of the 18th century coincided with his university's apogee, APOGEE. The university in Lower Saxony, whose capital was Hanover, offered not only the most up-to-date scholarship, but also an opening to the educated English-speaking world. For Hanoverians ruled Britain in the 18th century. Thus, Göttingen's situation accounts for a good part of the rapid spread of Blumenbach's ideas. Maintaining the status of a world-renowned scholar demanded more than profound thinking on important topics such as the place of humankind in nature. It also required influential contacts, honors, and backing of strong institutions, and something to show off, for instance, a collection of skulls or a royal garden. In the 2 generations preceding Blumenbach, the greatest European naturalists had tended royal gardens. Carolus Linnaeus in Uppsala, Sweden, and George Louis Leclerc, Commandant de Buffon in Paris, France, offer 2 prominent examples. In a sense, Blumenbach's garden was his collection of human skulls, and he knew how to cultivate his learned connections. Scholarly Networking explains Blumenbach's dedication of the 3rd edition of On the Natural Variety of Mankind to the immensely rich and powerful English wool merchant, naturalist Sir Joseph Banks, 1740 to 1820, someone he hardly knew. Blumenbach thanks Banks fulsomely for skulls and other precious scientific items, and for his hospitality in London in 1792. As the president of the Royal Society, Banks ruled the natural history establishment of the day, dominating worldwide scientific exploration. Blumenbach's dedication to Banks was intended to cement this tie between a humble researcher in Göttingen, still a provincial town compared with London and Paris, and a sovereign in Europe's scientific kingdom. For Blumenbach, corresponding with Banks not only bolstered his standing as a scientist with international connections, it also eased the way for requests to Banks for exotic skulls and other specimens Banks controlled. Among Banks' many sponsorships was his support of the collection of the unique plant and animal specimens gathered during Captain James Cook's 2nd voyage in 1772 through 1775 to the bay in newly discovered Australia that Cook named Botany. Blumenbach coveted these rare specimens for his collection, but without success. In 1783, he initiated a correspondence in French with Banks, sending him information on German plants. Blumenbach soon joined the legions of pilgrims to Banks' home and his vast scientific collection. In a 1787 letter back to Blumenbach, Banks explains the impossibility of sending Blumenbach a skull from the South Sea because Petrus Camper in the Netherlands has an earlier claim. But Blumenbach was not easily deterred. By dint of persistent correspondence in French and then in English, he finally wangled a South Seas skull out of Banks, who sharply reminded Blumenbach of the difficulty of wresting body parts from native peoples. At any rate, continuing to flatter the most powerful figure in late 18th century natural history, Blumenbach proclaimed the South Seas skull a representation of a new variety, the Malay, and placed it between the beautiful Caucasian and the ugly Mongolian. Thus, Blumenbach's 1795 dedication to Banks both cemented a Western European alliance and made an offering to a god of science. By the end of his life, Blumenbach owned Europe's greatest collection. He called it his Golgotha, 245 whole skulls and fragments, and 2 mummies. Down here, Germany's National Society Germany's National Socialist regime took such anthropological collecting of skeletons and skulls to a perverted, murderous extreme. Blumenbach was no firebrand. He worked along strictly scientific lines of the time, advancing the burgeoning science of human taxonomy in two important aspects. First, he eliminated the popular and long-standing classification of monsters, including diseased people, as separate human varieties, a category that had appeared even in the otherwise solid work of Linnaeus. Okay, now here's another, less gently than Blumenbach. Buffon criticized Linnaeus for confusing monsters with races. Linnaeus also associated geography with temperament, a linkage that became commonplace in the 19th and 20th centuries. First, he eliminated the popular and long-standing classification of monsters, including diseased people, as separate human varieties, a category that had appeared even in otherwise solid work of Linnaeus. Second, he used what he and his peers saw as a complete and scientific means of classification. In addition to the now commonly accepted index of skin color, he factored in a series of other bodily measurements, notably of skulls. Oh, sorry about moving things there. The hold our spot. There we go. Unlike Petrus Camper, Blumenbach measured skulls in a number of ways, inaugurating a mania for ever more elaborate measurement. Placing scores of human skulls from around the world in a line and measuring the height of the foreheads, the size and angle of the jawbone, the angle of the teeth, the eye sockets, the nasal bones, and also Camper's facial angle, Blumenbach came up with what he called the Norma Verticalis. Adding skin color to the Norma Verticalis, he classified the single species of human beings into 4 and then 5 varieties. As we shall see, such meticulous measurement endowed the Caucasian variety with an unimpeachable scientific pedigree. First edition of On the Natural Variety of Mankind from 1775 has many strengths. For one thing, it corrects a serious misconception about differences between various peoples. Climate, Blumenbach says reasonably, but in contradiction to others, produces differences in skin color, so that dark-skinned people live in hot places and light-colored people live in cold places. A fact noted in antiquity, but subsequently acknowledged only intermittently in the scholarly literature. He reminds readers that all individual human bodies contain lighter and darker places. The genitals, for instance, of light-colored people may be dark, and outdoor work darkens even people with light skin. Poor people who work outside become darker, and European skin becomes lighter in winter. Our own experience teaches us every year when in spring very elegant, delicate women show a most brilliant whiteness of skin, contracted by the indoor life of winter. If those women are careless and go into the summer sun and air, they lose that vernal beauty before the arrival of the next autumn and become sensibly browner. Blumenbach also cautions against drawing conclusions about whole peoples on the basis of only a small sample, a warning unfortunately not heeded, as the world of anthropology invariably continued to speak of human types embodied in the image of one single person. Take as an example the aforementioned Kalmucks of the northeastern Caucasus and Western Asian regions, says Blumenbach. Well aware of the stereotype of Kalmucks as epitomes of ugliness, he warns us quite properly that one traveler's drawing of an ugly Kalmuk skull cannot sustain conclusions about the group as a whole. Blumenbach imagines that another traveler might describe Kalmuk men as beautiful, even as symmetrical, and conclude that their young women would find admirers in cultivated Europe. Blumenbach's allusion to young women's sexual attractiveness to European men evokes a gauge common among European travelers and scholars as far back as Francois Bernier in the 17th century. The French naturalist Buffon, for instance, pronounced Kalmucks the ugliest of peoples, the women as ugly as the men, but Circassians and Georgians the beautiful wives of Eastern sultans. As we are seeing, Kalmucks remained salient exemplars of homeliness well into the 19th century. However, photographs from William Z. Ripley's 1899 Races of Europe and Corliss Lamont's Peoples of the Soviet Union of 1946 show two rather ordinary Kalmucks and a handsome one. Okay. There's a figure here with somebody in it. Thus, assumptions about the beautiful or the ugly pertained more to ideas than to actual physical appearance, as we have also seen regarding Circassians and Caucasians and Georgians. The notion of their surpassing beauty became codified more by repetition than by any circulation of actual images of real people. Like other race theorists, Blumenbach walked a tightrope between contradictions. On the one hand, he held fast to the prominent role that culture and climate play in determining outward appearance. Even so, he believed that certain groups maintain their distinctive physical and cultural characteristics over successive generations. Among the people of Europe, say, the Swiss retain their open countenance. The Turks remain manly and serious. The people of the far north keep their simple and guileless look, and despite long residence among Gentiles, the Jewish race presents the most notorious and least deceptive example, which can easily be recognized everywhere by their eyes alone, which breathe of the East. That was a quote. This last statement, delivered as scientific fact, turns up throughout racial science, deathless as the worship of the beautiful Caucasian, Circassian, and Georgian. All of this classification appears in Blumenbach's first edition, revising On the Natural Variety of Mankind in 1781. He adds the newly discovered Malays, thereby introducing a five-fold categorization. Please note, however, that Europeans are not yet labeled Caucasian. Blumenbach explains that 5 groups termed varieties are more consonant to nature than the 4 Lionists had enumerated, and that Blumenbach had originally accepted. Here's a little side note. To explain his addition of this new group, Malay, Blumenbach cites the account of Johann Reinhold Forster from 1729 to 1798 of Captain James Cook's second voyage to the South Pacific, on which Forster and his son George headed a team of naturalists of English background. Both Forsters lived and worked in Germany. They published accounts of the voyage. George Forster a voyage around the world in his Britannic Majesty's sloop Resolution, commanded by Captain James Cook, during the years 1772, 3, 4, and 5, and this was written in 1777, and Johann Reinhold Forster observations made during a voyage around the world on physical geography, natural history, and ethic philosophy from 1778. Johann Reinhold Forster was accepted into the Royal Societies in 1771, George Forster in 1777, sponsored by Sir James Banks. Woo! How did I get to that? There we go. In 1781, Blumenbach also returns to the problem of the Lapps, the LAPPS, finally admitting them as Europeans of Finnish origin, white in color, and if compared with the rest, beautiful in form. As Europeans continue to discover ever more human communities, increasing numbers of peoples and their geographical boundaries aggravated the chaos of classification, Blumenbach revised once again. In his third edition, published on the 11th of April of 1795, Blumenbach does not increase the number of human varieties, but he gamely notes the existence of 12 competing schemes of human taxonomy and invites the reader to choose which of them he likes best. 3 experts, including his Göttingen colleague Christoph Meiners, designate 2 varieties. Meiners are, Meiners. So Meiners were handsome and ugly. 1 posits 3, 6 designate 4. 1 buffoon speaks of 6 varieties. Lapp or polar, Tartar, South Asian, European, Ethiopian, and American, and 1 designates 7. Such anarchy had dogged human taxonomy from the beginning, for scholars could never agree on how many varieties of people existed, where the boundaries between them lay, and which physical traits counted in separating them, nor have 200 and more years of racial inquiry diminished confusion on this issue. Blumenbach's idea of 5 varieties gained acceptance, but it was his introduction of aesthetic judgments into classifications in 1795 that gave us the term Caucasian. By 1795, 20 years had passed since the first publication of On the Natural Variety of Mankind. In the interim, skin color, not heretofore the crucial factor for Blumenbach, had risen to play a large role. He now sees it necessary to rank skin color hierarchically, beginning, not surprisingly, with white. Believing it to be the oldest variety of man, he puts it in the first place. His reckoning includes a large dose of aesthetic reasoning, led by the blush. All right, let's see what that little side note is on the blush. The most accessible discussion of Blumenbach and his 5-fold racial classification lies in Stephen Jay Gould, The Mismeasure of Man, and a revised edition, New York, W.W. Norton, 1996, ESP 401 through 12. However, as Thomas Junker points out, Gould's visual representation of Blumenbach's racial geometry conveys a misleading impression. You'll have to see Junker, Blumenbach's Racial Geometry, ISIS 89, number 3, from 1998, page 498 through 501. All right. The white color holds the first place, such as that of most European peoples. The redness of the cheeks in this variety is almost peculiar to it. At all events, it is but seldom to be seen in the rest. After white comes the yellow olive tinge, then third, copper color or bronze. Fourth is tawny or bassane, and last the tawny black, up to almost a pitchy blackness. It's called jet black. Like the first and second editions, this third edition of On the Natural Variety of Mankind keeps on ascribing differences of skin color to climate and individual experience in non-Europeans as well as Europeans. Blumenbach seems once again to be arguing with himself, disregarding his own equitable explanation of individual difference, and yet describing the racial face of each of his 5 human varieties. He dwells longest and lovingly on the Caucasian, from whom Lapps, having in 1781 been allowed a place, are once again excluded. All right, we're rolling now. Caucasian variety. Color white, cheeks rosy, hair brown or chestnut colored, head subglobular, face oval, straight, its parts moderately defined, forehead smooth, nose narrow, slightly hooked, mouth small, the primary teeth placed perpendicular to each jaw, the lips, especially the lower one, moderately open, the chin full and rounded. In general, that kind of appearance which, according to our opinion of symmetry, we consider most handsome and becoming. To this first variety belong the inhabitants of Europe, except the Lapps and the remaining descendants of the Finns, and those of Eastern Asia, as far as the river Obi, the Caspian Sea, and the Ganges, and lastly those of North Africa. That's the end of the little writing there. Now we continue with the rest of the writing. Like many other anthropologists, Blumenbach labels North Africans Caucasian. No problem there, at least not for the moment. But by placing the Caucasian varieties' eastern boundaries further to the east than the Ural Mountains, and as far south as the Ganges, Blumenbach enlarges Caucasian territory beyond the limits then becoming accepted as European. Okay, let's see here. Hang on. Blumenbach places Caucasians as far east as the river Ob, one of Russia's greatest rivers. The Obi flows north out of Central Asia, passing Novosibirsk, Russia's third most populous city, and empties into the Kara Sea. All right. Russia, always a problem, was sometimes placed within, sometimes outside Europe. By bringing India into the Caucasian fold, Blumenbach was doubtless thinking linguistically. In 1786, the linguistic Sir William Jones had traced similarities in various European and Asian languages to the archaic language of Sanskrit. Blumenbach's colleague and friend George Forster had translated Jones' version of an ancient Sanskrit classic drama into German in 1791. Others soon transformed a linguistic category, the Indo-European or Aryan, into a race, giving rise to the idea of a biologically determined Indo-European people. By the mid-19th century, scrupulous scholars had rejected any biological basis to the Indo-European Aryan language group, but that hardly mattered. The judgment of sound scholarship did not suffice to kill off the notion of an Indo-European Aryan race, with Germans and Greeks within, the Semites outside. For determined racists, especially in the 20th century, racial identity and language always had to coincide. An appearance would always figure in concepts of race. Race begat beauty, and even scientists succumbed to desire. With the concept of human beauty as a scientifically certified racial trait, we come to a crucial turning point in the history of white people. Now linking Caucasian firmly to beauty, Blumenbach remained divided of mind. Holding first place in his classification was always the scientific measurement of skulls. But second, within human variety came a concern for physical beauty, going well beyond the beauty of skulls and giving birth to a powerful word in race thinking: Caucasian variety. I have taken the name of this variety from Mount Caucasus, both because its neighborhood, and especially its southern slope, produces the most beautiful race of men. I mean, the Georgian. A long footnote follows, quoting the 17th century traveler Jean Chardin as only one of a cloud of eyewitnesses praising the beauty of Georgian women. Blumenbach's quote leaves out Chardin's disapproval of Georgians' heavy use of makeup, their sensuality, and the many bad habits Chardin had deplored. Now Chardin intones to Blumenbach the gospel of Georgian beauty. Here's the little note. The blood of Georgia is the best of the East, and perhaps in the world. I have not observed a single ugly face in that country, in either sex, but I have seen angelic ones. Nature has there lavished upon the women beauties which are not to be seen elsewhere. I consider it to be impossible to look at them without loving them. It would be impossible to point to more charming visages or better figures than those of the Georgians. I've got me a hot dog in here. One hot dog. Okay, let's see. Just a couple more pages. Beauty's charms reached into science. But what of science's bedrock, the measurement of skulls? Now Blumenbach squirms. By turns he embraces Enlightenment science, the measurements of his skulls. Then let's go to reach for Romanticism, subjective passion for beauty. Yes, skull measurements count, but when it comes down to it, bodily beauty counts for more. But no, not conclusively. Even while extolling Caucasian beauty, he adopts a third line of reasoning meant to puncture European racial chauvinism. Considering the toads, says Blumenbach, here's his quote, if a toad could speak and were asked which was the loveliest creature upon God's earth, it would say, simpering, that modestly forbade it to give a real opinion on that point. What? As in the first edition of On the Natural Variety of Mankind, Blumenbach qualifies his estimation of European beauty as rife with European narcissism. Even so, he uses the word beautiful 5 times on one page in describing the bony foundation of his favorite typology, a Georgian woman's skull. It is, he says, my beautiful, typical head of a young Georgian female, which always of itself attracts every eye, however little observant. Here, as would other so-called authorities in race thinking, Blumenbach falls back on the authority of untutored observers to reinforce his scientific truths. The story of Blumenbach's skull belongs within a long and sorry history of Caucasian vulnerabilities to 18th century Russian imperialism. Blumenbach's benefactor, George Thomas Igor Fedorovich Baron von Asch, from 1729 to 1807, is little known today. Born in Petersburg of German parents, Asch had secured his medical degree from the University of Göttingen in 1750, and then joined the Russian Army's medical service in the imperial forces of Catherine the Great. A military man and a leader of Russia's learned societies in St. Petersburg and Moscow, Asch traveled around and expanding Russian empire, both in his official capacity and as a patron of science. Regarding the latter, he collected skulls, manuscripts, and various other trophies from throughout Russia and its hinterlands. In the 1780s and 1790s, specimens he showered on Blumenbach and the research collections of his Göttingen alma mater. Little side note here. Asch had begun his medical studies in Tübingen and then finished them in Göttingen in 1750 with the famous Albrecht von Haller. Before Blumenbach's time, Asch was born in the same year as Blumenbach's brother-in-law, the classicist Christian Gottlieb Hein, who was responsible for the Göttingen University Library. The Asch-Hein correspondence began in 1771, holds over 120 letters from Asch to Hein, many accompanying Asch's generous gifts to the Göttingen University Library. In Göttingen, Asch is known as one of the library's foremost patrons, for in addition to sending Blumenbach numerous skulls, he also enriched the university's library collection with gifts of Slavic and Persian books. Okay. In 1793, shortly after Catherine had won her second Caucasian War against the Ottomans, Asch sent Blumenbach a pristine female skull, explaining its provenance in a cover letter. The skull came from a Georgian woman the Russian forces had taken captive, precisely the kind of situation figuring in so many descriptions of beautiful Caucasian and Circassian women. As an archetype, she is a pitiful, captive lovely in her subjection. Actually, the perfect appearance of the teeth support a suspicion that the owner was a very young person, indeed more adolescent than woman. In this case, the story continued to its tragic end when the woman or girl was brought back to Moscow. Although Asch sheds little light on her life in Russia, he does tell us that she died from venereal disease. An anatomy professor in Moscow had performed an autopsy before forwarding the skull to Asch in St. Petersburg. Ironically, perhaps, the woman whose skull gave white people a name had been a sex slave in Moscow, like thousands of her compatriots in Russia and the Ottoman Empire. Blumenbach labeled his prize skull beautiful and female Georgian, going on to call the human variety it inspired Caucasian. Mysterious slippage. He did not explain. Why not call it Georgian, we may ask, since the skull came from Georgia? The answer may lie in North America, where the newly formed United States already included a state called Georgia, and presumably people called Georgians. At any rate, during Blumenbach's time, the notion of Caucasian achieved wide circulation. There's another one of those tiny notes. In the 20th century, the most famous of the people from the Georgia of Russian fame was Iosif Vissarionovich Dogashvili, better known as Joseph Stalin, man of steel, whose relentless use of power largely overshadowed considerations of his looks. Okay, I lost my spot. Hang on. Blumenbach's idea of Caucasian was as much mythical as geographical. On the one hand, he means the 170,000 square miles of land separating the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, comprising the embattled Muslim Chechnya as well as Christian Georgia, and being home to some 50 ethnic groups. Today, anthropologists parse these ethnicities into three main categories: Caucasian, Indo-European, and Altaic. Among the Altaic peoples are the Kalmyk, whom Western tradition deemed ugly. Right beside them live the Circassians and Georgians, those beautiful white slave people of legend, both in the category of Caucasian peoples. Note that in 1899, William Z. Ripley pictured Caucasians in his Authoritative Races of Europe. Couple more pages. Whiteness now takes its place in racial classification, reorienting the science of human taxonomy from Linnaeus's geographical regions to Blumenbach's emphasis on skin color as beauty. Once Blumenbach had established Caucasian as a human variety, the term floated far from its geographical origin. Actual Caucasians, the people living in the Caucasus region, cheek by jowl with Turks and Semites of the Eastern Mediterranean, lost their symbolic standing as Europeans. Real Caucasians never reached the apex of the white racial hierarchy. Indeed, many Russians call them Chernai, black, on account of their supposed wild troublesomeness. Somehow specificity faded, while the idea of a supremely beautiful Caucasian variety lived on, eventually becoming the scientific term of choice for white people. When scholars nowadays use Caucasian as racial terminology, they are harking back to the illustrious Blumenbach. But the term has a more complex genealogy too, one connecting it to the larger history of race, beauty, and reactionary politics. Oh, that was so good. Hang on, everybody. Oh. The part of the story brings in Blumenbach's cranky Göttingen colleague Christopher Meiners from 1747 to 1810. There's a picture of him here. For lack of documentation, we cannot know the exact degree of the personal interaction between Blumenbach and Meiners. Clearly, however, Meiners, with his preoccupation with human beauty and his counter-revolutionary politics, shadows the background of German racial theory. Both Blumenbach and Meiners studied and then taught at the University of Göttingen, where Meiners assumed a professorship in 1776, about the same time as Blumenbach. The eminence of the egalitarian-minded Blumenbach lives on, and when Blumenbach died at 88 in 1840, his membership in 78 learned societies attested to his eminence in the masculine realm of letters. What? I feel like I slept through that or something. Here, let me add some more. Meaner's life is not nearly as well documented as Blumenbach's. The fullest recent sources for information in his regard are found in the works of Doherty, Zentrop, Britta, Rupp, Eisenreich, and Carhart, and mentioned in this chapter's end notes. And then organizations like the Royal Societies of London and St. Petersburg and Göttingen's own Royal Scientific Society brought together scholars and moneybags from across the Western world. Alright, take my shoes off. Hang on. I may be cold, but it's driving me crazy. Okay, there we go. One shoe down. Okay, led by the illustrious Humboldt, Blumenbach's students had supervised the celebration of his jubilee, the 50th anniversary of his doctorate in 1825. The politically retrograde Meaners has largely been forgotten. During the 1790s, Blumenbach, already the more distinguished colleague, seems to have taken note of Meaner's voluminous, if obscure, publications. To be sure, Meaner's name appears only once in the 1795 edition of Varieties of Humankind, but Blumenbach's emphasis, notably beauty, and the evocation of an ancient Greek ideal, and the repeated mention of Tacitus and the ancient Germans' racial purity, and even the name Caucasian, betray the pull of his contrary colleague. Both Meaners and Blumenbach focused on the same towering subject, humankind's divisions. But otherwise, their views diverged over methodology, politics, and conclusions, converging only on the naming of varieties and increasingly the importance of personal appearance. Blumenbach, as we know, accorded pride of place to skull measurement, whereas Meaners relied on travel literature with its inevitable ethnocentrism. Another difference? Meaners wrote hastily and at a great length, distorting the meaning of scholars he cited and filling his pages with wildly contradictory claims. Blumenbach and more rigorous colleagues, though themselves no paragons of consistency, objected to such sloppiness, criticizing Meaner's reactionary, intellectual one-sidedness. Meaners made no bones about it. Inferior people's inferiority justified, even required, their enslavement and the use of despotism for their control. Beauty and ugliness, he said, led naturally to different fates. Blumenbach did not agree. Meaners initially posited a counterintuitive binary racial scheme, whose strange two-way racial classification appears in Foundations of the History of Mankind, published in 1785. The first category, let's pull out a little bit, there's something different. That'll probably be blurry, I can't see anything. Okay, there we go. Number 1, Tartar, Caucasian, divided into Celtic and Slavic, and number 2 is Mongolian. The Tartar Caucasian was first and foremost the beautiful race. The Mongolian was the ugly race, weak in body and spirit, bad and lacking in virtue, as characterized by the Kalmucks. Meaners classified Jews as Mongolian, i.e. Asian, along with Armenians, Arabs, and Persians, all of whom Blumenbach defined as Caucasian. Meaners makes his ugly Mongolian race dark-skinned, and he joins most of his German contemporaries in locating the ideal of human beauty in ancient Greece. But he adds immodestly that Germans rival the Greeks in beauty and bodily strength. Gottingen's scholarly community muttered a good deal about Mener's lack of rigor and cranky conclusions, but mostly the criticisms remained buried in private and rather academic letters. In any case, Mener's fringy popularity was widespread, and his work circulated extensively. Foundations of the History of Mankind went through 3 editions and was translated into several languages. The popular Berlin writer Auguste Lafontaine published a 4-volume satirical novel making fun of Mener's and his ugly, dark, and beautiful blonde people in 1795-96. His circle included French counter-revolutionaries who later fed the intellectual history of 20th century National Socialism. Blumenbach may well have borrowed the name Caucasian from Mener's, but even if that borrowing took place, Blumenbach reached for higher authority in publication. He cited the illustrious Jean Chardin. Woo! I'm cooking in this little vehicle here. Okay. He cited the illustrious Jean Chardin, not his neighbor's cantankerous book. Though Mener's lacked the status of a member of Royal Society, he did convince a certain circle of his own acolytes. In the early 1790s, Mener's began to move racial discourse into Göttingen beyond comparisons between European and non-Europeans and to concentrate on an intra-European hierarchy of lightness and beauty, with ancient Germans on top. In a series of articles vaunting the superiority of Germans among Europeans, Mener's describes non-German Europeans' color as dirty white and compares it unfavorably with the whitest, most blooming, and most delicate skin of the Germans. The early Germans he describes as, quote, taller, slimmer, stronger, and with more beautiful bodies than all the remaining peoples of the earth, unquote. Mener's maintains, following Tacitus, that Germans possess the prized quality of racial purity. By the late 18th century, Mener's was making claims for stereotypical Nordic, Teutonic attributes that some in the academic world would echo for another 100 years. That was radical enough, but he did not stop there. As his thought continued to evolve, Mener's teased out distinctions not only between different kinds of Europeans, but also between different kinds of Germans. Germans of the North and Germans of the South. Northerners, such as the Protestants of Dresden, Weimar, Berlin, Hanover, and Göttingen, were in. Southerners, the Catholics of Vienna, were out. This may seem a strange dichotomy, but in fact it was not new. At this time, the idea of southern Germany meant Vienna, the sophisticated 1900-year-old capital of the Holy Roman Empire. That empire, self-proclaimed heir of the Roman Empire of antiquity, sprawled across Europe from the Low Countries of the Czech, Slovak, and Hungarian lands bordering the Ottoman Empire. It might have been on its next to last legs, but Vienna created a barrier against the Germanic tribes, still occupied at least a rhetorical space between peoples within and those outside civilization. Thus, differences between southern and northern Germans in the late 18th century could be thought to resemble Caesar's and Tacitus's civilized Gauls within the Roman Empire and wild Germans. Those northerners outside. Envy also played its part. A wealthy imperial capital, Vienna, had long boasted a high culture beyond the means of Germans of the north. Such envy, coupled easily with contempt, was only a small step for North Germans to feminize the Viennese, to turn them into soft gulls and trumpet the enduring masculinity of untamed Northerners. This anti-civilization strategy gendered North and South, Gaul and German, a Gaul/French, a German/German metaphor that held a promising future as an anthropological strategy. It also contained a political dimension. Like most advocates of racial hierarchy, Meaners resented the French for their revolution, which had led to unfortunate leveling tendencies in the German lands, and critically, to Jewish emancipation. It is not surprising, therefore, that Meaners later became the Nazis' favorite intellectual ancestor, for he knew his tacticus and built castles upon it. In phrases characteristic of 19th century Teutomania, Meaners describes Germans' possession of the whitest, most blooming and most delicate skin, the tallest and most beautiful men not only in Europe but in the entire world, and a purity of blood that made them the physical, moral, and intellectual superiors of everyone. The ancient Germans were strong like oak trees, but their descendants, though still better than everyone else, had degenerated through indulgence in civilization's luxuries. Rigorous practice of the martial arts would restore Germans to their former virility and beauty. And the last paragraph of this chapter. Some in Europe lapped up this super racist theory, as Meaners attracted a coterie of French counter-revolutionaries in the late 1790s, including Jean-Joseph Viry, whose Histoire naturelle des genres humains from 1800 divided humanity into beautiful whites and ugly browns or blacks, and Charles de Villers, a correspondent with Madame Germaine de Stael and an expert on Kant. Villers settled in Göttingen and studied with Meaners. With his influence on de Stael, German racial theory moved west. It consisted of a bundle of notions predicated on contrast between European and African, but also between European and Asian, Northerner and Southerner, lighter and darker, and Germans and French. I appreciate you. Thank you for letting me read to you today.